Hello guys, and welcome back to DarkHorseFM, and this is the part 3 of the team instructions video. And in this video we're going to look at out of possession instructions and how I interpret Football Manager instructions when the team is out of possession. Now this is the default for Football Manager. You have a mid block with a standard defensive line and everything else unchecked and the standard trigger press. So the first thing we're going to look at your team's defensive shape. Default being a mid block is that your team is going to stay in a compact shape close to the defensive line and close to the attacking engagement line. They're not going to try to force a press if the press isn't on, if there isn't a situation to actually trigger press. But it doesn't mean that your team is not going to press the opposition. They will still press. It's just that they are in a more calculated, more controlled version of pressing, where they actually wait for the opposition to make a mistake or wait for the opposition to play the ball to a certain player before they actually go on to trigger that press. So what's going to happen, this is, you use this out of possession instructions side by side with the team's opposition instructions. So if you have a mid block, it means that we're trying to compress the field to this region here, this where the central midfielders, often because you kind of lose possession in this region more than anything. So the mid block kind of operates in this sense. It's like the standard region where the ball is played. So you have a dangerous player in Liam Scullion, let's say this kind of player here. You can look at his composure and concentration and decision making. He's quite weak in all those areas. So he's the one player that you're going to want to trigger press Liam Scullion, for example. So now we go back to our tactics. In the board here, when the ball is played to Scullion, he is going to be the one that the team is going. The moment the ball is played to him and he's in the middle third, they will go on to trigger press him. That's kind of how the mid block works. And if you have a more often trigger press, your team is going to likely want to trigger the press on Scullion a lot faster than they normally would if it was standard. So they will shift out of position a lot more. So it's dangerous, but it's also helpful in attack, and we'll explain that much later in the video. And the next thing we're going to look at is the higher press instruction. So what this does is that when you have a high press selected, your pressing doesn't wait until the ball gets into the middle of the field before your team starts to press. They will start to press the opposition from the front. And what that does is that it kind of changes your opposition instructions automatically or dramatically. So what's going to happen is that Scullion is the player. You can still go on to press Liam Scullion, but your players are also going to look to press the defensive midfielders or the defenders in the opposition's territory. Now, if without a high press, you can't really press the central defenders and the central defenders or the fullbacks. You need a high press to actually go on to press the back four of the opposition. So you have a mid block, and then you go on to ask your assistant to recommend who is going to trigger press. Rarely would the assistant recommend somebody in the defender position or in the opposition's back line. It's usually going to be somebody in the middle of the field. So that's what high press does. High press allows you to get into the opposition's back four and try to press those players, and it's often used with a more trigger press. Now you can use high press with a standard press, probably still works, but more often trigger press kind of encourages the high press. So now that we have high press selected, we can go into the opposition's back four and see who is the weakest when it comes to composure, decision making. And we have a very brave centre back here in Peter Grant. He has good determination. Decision making is like 8, but we can look at Peter Logan Donashki. This guy actually scored me a goal in one game. You can see his composure is 6 and their decision making is 9. So just looking at the player attributes, comparing him to Peter Grant, composure is 8, but you can just choose which of these players you want to trigger press. You can't, well, I was going to say you can't trigger press both of them, but you're going to need the players to do that. It's possible that you can go on to trigger press both of these players, but it's always good to trigger press one of them and then have another of them on type marking, particularly the player that is more composed on the ball, the player that has better attributes to actually go on to type mark him, so the opposition will not play the ball to him. They will play the ball to somebody else, and the player that is often the weaker player, and then you can go on to trigger press that player and get the ball from him. It works really well with the high press. That's the opposition's back four being on the press. The next we're going to look at is, I'm going to actually go on to increase to a much more often trigger press now, and then I'm going to shift this to a low block, because with Atletico Madrid, this is what I did to actually win the league. And okay, I think we took second before we eventually won the league. But if you have a much more often trigger press, you can have a much more often trigger press with a low block, but this is still going to actually shift your players out of possession. But it also means that your team is going to wait until the opposition is in the final or in your initial third, in your defensive third, before your team is actually going to relentlessly try to press the ball. Until the ball gets here, your players will not try to press. They will still be in their solid shape and try to protect their defense. But the moment the opposition crosses the halfway line, they are in the danger zone, and then your team is actually going to try and relentlessly press them and win the ball back as quickly as they can. This kind of works if you have a composed back four in the opposition or a composed defensive midfielder. A composed defensive midfielder is quite risky because you will want to tag mark him or press him in any way. But if you have players that are quite good on the ball and you try to trigger press them, it doesn't work. A low block kind of works. Or this encourages the opposition to get the ball into your defensive third, where you have a lot more numbers and you have players that are quite good at defending and pressing and winning the ball back, and also attackers that may not be so strong, not be so brave, and you can actually go on to outpress them in this defensive third and try to win the ball back. It works well for defensive systems. Now, the prevent shot goalkeeper distribution works quite well with a high press. What this does is that it encourages the goalkeeper to actually play the ball long. This is useful if you have tall players. If you don't have tall players, it's really a bad thing to actually prevent short goalkeeper distributions, because the goalkeeper is going to play the ball long and it's going to play to their own player and they win the header before you. So you don't want that. So it's usually useful if you have tall players in your team. You can actually force the opposition to kick the ball long. Now, you don't necessarily always have to do this with a high press. I think with the mid block it also works. It kind of goes down to tight marking or trigger pressing most of the opposition's back four players that the goalkeeper will ideally want to play the ball short to. You can go on to kind of tight mark those key players, and then when you turn on that instruction, your players are going to look to block the outlets that the goalkeeper would have had if he's playing the ball short, and that way he's forced to just kick it long, and then you can obviously win the ball in the air. Get stuck in, on the other hand, is the tackle harder instruction applied across the board. Now, if you look at the individual player roles, you can have a player here that is selected, or in a player instruction you have tackle harder selected for him, and then in this other player we do not have tackle harder selected for him, so just specific players are tackling harder. But if you go into the team instruction and you select get stuck in, everybody in the team is now required to tackle harder. So if they're going to tackle the opposition, they will be forceful and combative in the way they tackle, and it could also invite fouls, yellow cards, red cards, something like that. But it kind of imposes your will on the opposition and forces them to, be scared, and especially if the opposition is not brave, they will be so fragile in defense and then tend to lose possession very easily. So it has its ups and downs. The step up more instruction is quite tricky. I'm just going to disable this other too. When you go into the step up more instruction, what it does is that it encourages your team to actually push higher up the field to try and compress the space the opposition has to play the ball. Often this kind of works well in also forcing the opposition to play the ball out of defense quickly, because they will not actually have space to play shorter passing and try to play out of the defense. So you have step up more, you're actually compressing the field with a lot more numbers, and it's kind of shifting. Let's say you have a much higher defensive line and then you have a high press. Step up more is actually going to allow your team to actually shift this much higher defensive line even much higher, a lot closer, to try and force the opposition to give up that possession of the ball. It may also force them to play a long ball over the top, so you have to be careful how you do that. It kind of lends players into the press and then allows your fullbacks, to some degree maybe the center backs, to try and get ahead really high and try to win possession of that ball. Drop off more is the opposite, because it's going to allow your team to step up a lot more. To step off a lot more. What this does is that it kind of works over the regroup instruction. So if you have the regroup selected and then the step and the drop off more instruction selected, when your team loses possession of the ball, they will tend to just shift back. Even if you have a mid block and a standard defensive line, your team is still going to take a step back and try to protect the defense. According to this description, is a safety first approach that is encouraging your team to try and stay closer to their own goal and defend from there. The trapping inside and trapping outside is what we used to call the defensive width before. What this does is that, I'm going to just go back to the tactics screen here. If I have a defensive midfielder in this position here, come on Newton, move, okay. If I have a defensive midfielder in that position and then I have a flat back four, if I'm trapping the opposition inside, I'm forcing the wide players of the opposition to actually cut inside instead of go out wide and cross the ball. So it means that I'm asking them to come and meet my defensive midfielder that is in position here, this defensive midfielder. So instead of going out wide to try and cross the ball beyond the fullback, they will tend to cut inside and come and meet my defensive midfielder. And it's good if this guy is a destroyer, very aggressive tackler or ball winner. This guy can actually go on to recycle possession and win possession for you when the team is cutting inside. You kind of do this if you're playing against a team that is playing as crossing team, where they have wing play as their system and they have wingers that actually go on to cross the ball, or fullbacks that actually go on to cross the ball. You're forcing them to come inside and try to meet the defensive midfielder instead. You're forcing them to actually make different decisions. Trapping outside, on the other hand, means you have a fullback, or both fullbacks are quite good in defending the wide areas. If the opposition is quite good in cutting inside, or they have good players that have left-sided players like this that are good with their right foot and then they like to cut inside, you want to show them outside so they don't have to cut inside and then try to score. This tends to work well in the modern game because a lot of players are quite good on both feet and they tend to cut inside a whole lot. So if you have the trap outside instruction, it kind of helps you force the team, the inside forward or inverted winger that likes to cut inside, to actually go out wide and try to cross the ball. And if you have the stop crosses selected, it also works that way, that it goes on to try and nullify the threat of that opposition's winger that was trying to cut inside. The moment he goes out wide, you can actually force him and then stop the cross, tackle him. You can ask your fullback to actually close down a lot more and tackle harder, encouraging him that when the player goes out wide, you go on to tackle him and then win possession of the ball. So that in a nutshell is the out of possession team instruction, is the way I understand it and the way I interpret it. If you do have additional questions regarding any of the instructions that I shared today or in any of the other videos, you can let me know in the comment section. Till then, enjoy your football manager. I'll see you in the next video.